Hello, I'm Dave Welch. I oversaw the reconstruction of the Orr home in the period 1996 to 2002. This is the story of that activity. The Orr home was the pioneer home of Nathaniel Orr and his family. Orr was an 1852 Oregon Trail immigrant. From 1857 to 1974, the home was only occupied by two generations of the family, Nathaniel and his son Glenn. The home evolved from a bachelor's workshop to a family home. It was acquired by the Steilacoom Historical Museum Association in 1974. Critical restoration needs were identified in the early 1990s by the home's curator, Joan Curtis. I retired in 1995 and was looking for something to do. I volunteered to help Joan. A work package was put together in 1995. Bids were solicited and the work was begun in early 1996. On May 13, 1996, the home fell from temporary supports and was severely damaged. This is the story of the recovery from that event, the fall and rise of the Orr home. This is the home as it appeared in 1995. The home site is a full one-half block in the town of Steilacoom. The site itself is on the National Register of Historic Places. Again from 1995, this picture shows the rear of the home, showing the add-on porch. Note that it's about 8 feet above ground level at this point at the back of the house. It's later construction, we're not sure of the date. Now let me call your attention to the pear tree on the left. It has much to do with the story that we're going to be telling. These pictures of the interior are from a little bit earlier, 1994, at the time of the Christmas at the Orr home, an event that occurs every other year. The upper left is the kitchen area, then the stairs going to the upstairs on the upper right, and the large bedroom at the back of the house on the second floor. Generally, the house is in good condition considering its age. The wallpaper, though, on the adjacent to the stairs going up was in relatively poor condition because of leakage, and we'll see some of the damage that was incurred also as a result of the home falling. This picture was taken at the rear of the house near the pear tree on the east or Balch Street side of the house. Note the batten board wood siding, vertical siding in this area. Clearly a modern wood structure. It's probably 1x10 milled lumber, so that's not original to the house. The big problem here is the wood touching the ground, and you can see the rot that's gone up several inches from it being constantly wet in the lower area. Note also that in the middle of this area is the gas service coming in. This is the front porch area. You can see again the rot in the lower area has been repaired at some point on the front porch. There obviously wasn't heavy use at this time since we have a vine growing across the porch at this point, and then an inappropriate glass protective door on the front of the house. The siding was original, but it was severely weathered on the south or front and west sides of the building. There were multi-layers of lead paint. Many of the windows in the building are original, but the mullions basically consisted of putty. There was very little wood structure left. There are 3 chimneys on the Orr home. They served wood stoves, but there were no fireplaces in the home. They were a brick construction, a stack of bricks that rested on a platform inside of each one of the rooms that they served. And each was connected via a pipe to a wood-burning stove. I think it's safe to conclude that none of the 3 chimneys would have survived the Nisqually earthquake of February 28, 2001. Let's go under the house. Recall that the house sits on sloping ground with the front resting on the ground and the back part of the house about 8 feet above ground. You can see that there's a patchwork of supports of varying quality. Note in particular this stack of boxes on the left with a final wedge placed there. I have no idea what that was trying to do. Here is more patchwork bracing. This is the area right below the kitchen, and again I call your attention to the hot water heater that's located in that area. But you can see how wedges were placed above posts and various boards stacked to achieve some kind of support. On the east side, one of the support posts has already fallen over. And on the right-hand side here, you can see a piece of tongue and groove flooring that has been wedged in below one of the joists. Even that is at the base is in very poor condition. I can't imagine what anyone thought they were doing with that particular support. Let's look at the home's construction in a little more detail. It's basically constructed by first establishing a box with the sill beams, and on one end the sill beam or sill box rests on the ground. That's at the front door, and at the back it's supported by a vertical post about 8 feet above the ground level to make the sill beam level. The house is constructed by nailing the vertical planks directly to the sill beam. The attachment of the vertical planks to the sill beam could have been done in a variety of different ways. I illustrated a couple of them here, where the basically a tenon and groove, a groove in the sill beam to which the vertical planks are inserted after notching them, or with a rabbet. These would have been a little bit stronger than what was done, which was to nail the planks directly to the sill beam, and in particular when that was exposed to the earth, like where the little red line is shown, it's subjected to rot from that point on. That probably would have been true no matter how they were done, but this was a somewhat crude way of attaching the planks to the sill beam. As I mentioned, the association had received some funding to do an assessment of the building's condition in the early 1990s. So we were aware of the structural issues. This chart summarizes what we had determined to be the problems: the sill beam condition, the vertical plank attachment, the absence of corner posts in a couple areas, especially the addition that became the kitchen, the sloping ground contributing to the lack of stability of the whole building. There were also problems with the attachment of the second floor to the building structure, and we'll get into that in more detail later. And the whole roof and roof structure were in very poor condition. When we started the project, we had about $100,000 in savings available to do this. And this is a summary of the various components that we were going to undertake. The total was about $69,000, and with a 10% contingency, we were at a total of about $76,000. So this was going to be a stretch. We were going to use up our savings, basically, to do this work. Before going on, I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the home, because that is a key part of the work that needed to be done. We believe it began in 1857 as Nathaniel Orr's workshop, and he was a bachelor at the time. He built a workshop. He had a variety of carpentry skills, and we think he built a workshop, and he perhaps had a loft at the front of the house on the second floor where he lived. And over time, the house was improved a little bit. Siding was added, became a little more finished, and perhaps with improvements to that second floor loft. And then about 1865, in the meantime, he had married. An addition was made to the building on the west side, and that added a separate kitchen and workspace on that side. Again, you can see that's a different construction when we look at it, but that's basically the evolution of the building. We also believe that initially the house had an entrance on the east side, or Ball Street side, at the second floor, that there was probably a stairway on the outside that went to the second floor with a door that's kind of in the center of the hallway. We'll see this a little bit later, where there was a storeroom used by the association. The bottom shows the addition, how that addition to the building was made for the kitchen. It's April 1996, and we've selected a contractor, and the project is underway. Here you can see the exposed sill beam and the attachments. We'll see more in detail after we removed the modern siding that was covering this area up. This shows details of the plank attachments to the sill beam, or the lack thereof. More of the same. I'm standing under the house near the northeast corner of the house, near that pine tree. The plan was to remove that siding, which you can see has been done, lift the building a few inches and brace it in place, and then excavate by hand for the basement. Once the excavation was done, then we could build the foundation and pour a floor for the basement. At that point, the building would be lowered back onto the foundation that had been built. When I took this picture, I was bothered by the lack of cross bracing, that it was all just vertical support, but it didn't trigger enough in me to take any action about it. The architect for our project, Gene Gerlich, had visited the site about the same time, and he had the same concerns, but neither one of us took action on those concerns, unfortunately. At the time the work was done in the basement, we did add some supports to the front of the house. The concern we had was mostly with the building moving in that direction. We have arrived at the fateful day. I believe it was about 9 a.m. when I received a call from Steilacoom Public Safety that the Orr home had collapsed, and that there was a very severe danger because of a gas leak. Recall that the gas meter on the other side was right up against the house, and as the house shifted in that direction, it sheared off the gas main. So we had a pretty high-risk situation there of a fire being started by the gas. Well, the gas was ultimately shut off, and then we could gain access to the house. You can see in this photograph that the house is down. At first glance, it may not appear to be too bad, but you can see how the whole structure was bent, the bow in the roof, and that the back of the house is on the ground where it was 8 feet above the ground. And the chimneys are also all down at this point. So what happened? Well, on that date, we had strong winds out of the southwest. Recall from the previous discussion that we had no lateral bracing in the basement, where the house was now resting solely on the vertical supports. So it's my theory that the house basically blew down. There was a strong wind acting upon this flat surface that you see here of the upper floor and the lower floor, and basically the house blew over. The damage is a little more obvious in this picture of the rear of the home. Here you can see that the porch, the later addition, is essentially destroyed. And the back of the house, again, is on the ground where it was about 8 feet above the ground. Remember the pear tree? On the left we have the before picture, and on the right the after picture. You can see that the house basically slid against the pear tree, and I think most of us believe the pear tree saved the house. If the pear tree hadn't been there, the house would have kept moving in that same direction and probably would have collapsed like a house of cards. Now let's look at the inside of the house after the fall. The wallpaper in the hallway adjacent to the stairway had been replaced with a recreated original a number of years ago. It had some water damage prior to the time the house fell, but the fall of the house introduced some new problems. You can see that the paper split along each one of the vertical planks. This wall was originally an outside wall, so these vertical planks were the outside wall of the original workshop. This is looking into the pantry, and there's just a jumble of items that have fallen from the shelves. The heavy cast iron wood stove is leaning forward at the one side of this picture. On the left is the wood stove leaning against the pantry wall, and on the right you can see how the floor is pushed up below the table, and that's the area where the hot water heater was located in the basement. So as the house fell, it appears the hot water heater stayed in place and pushed up the floor. This caused some major structural damage in this area. These pictures were taken in the family room, the large room at the back of the house, and they're taken after some cleanup was done. The china cabinet on the left actually tipped forward and spewed all of its contents onto the table. You can see there was considerable breakage down on the floor there, but a lot of the items in it were not damaged. As the house fell and moved towards the northeast, it twisted, and this resulted in the disconnection of the stairs from the second floor structure, and also weakened all of the attachments of the second floor itself to the main structure of the house. This was a shock to those that first ventured up to the second floor. We thought we had our first fatality, but no, it's just Mandy the mannequin in the little storage room between the bedrooms upstairs. This is the same area that we think was actually the entrance to the second floor when there was a stairway on the outside. The picture on the right is in the workshop, which is in the area of the kitchen closest to the street. After some temporary bracing was applied to the house, the next step was to get all the contents out. So here we have moving day. We did hire movers to take the largest and heaviest items out of the house, and they were placed in storage at one of the houses at Fort Steilacoom that was loaned to us by the Fort Steilacoom Historical Society. Some other materials were placed temporarily in a storefront over at the Lakewood Mall. So here you see the moving out day. At this point, we obviously had a new project on our hands. The first step was to brace the building to hold it in place as best we could. On this picture, you can see that there's plywood sheeting added to the various parts of the building to lock it in place. We also have visqueen over the windows, and there's some corner bracing that you may be able to see just to try to hold the building together. Let's say something about the wooden structure. As the house fell, it did distort, and so it's out of square and out of alignment at this point. But the good thing about the structure is that it could also, because it was flexible, be put back into its original condition. There was nothing that was broken in a large scale that needed to be replaced. Basically, by pushing and shoving in the right points, you could bring the building back to square. We are now at April 1997, almost a year after the home fell, and you can see that progress was not great. However, we had been very busy with our fundraising activities, getting ready to reinitiate the project. The blue tarp that you see has a story in itself, perhaps the basis of a Charlie Chaplin movie if we wanted to go that way. Jerry Evanson contributed this tarp. He showed up at the site with this huge tarp, and he, along with Brad Randall and Dave Hopkins and myself, attempted to place this tarp over the house. It was also a very windy day, and our plan was to throw some ropes over the top of the house and then pull the tarp from one side to the other. Well, the first problem was that none of us had an arm strong enough to throw anything over the roof. So that was out, although I think we finally worked out a way of doing that in some manner. But once we had the tarp deployed and were trying to pull it over, the wind caught it, and it was like being on the Mayflower as the sails filled and pulled all four of us in the direction the wind was blowing. Well, somehow we managed to get it over and onto the roof and provide protection. And this became the signature of the house for, I think, the next couple of years. One of the first things that was done was to remove the rear porch. As I mentioned, it was of a different construction than the Pioneer home itself, and we're not sure exactly when it was built. The wood structure that was in it was a very much a modern common 2x4, and the siding was different than the siding on the main house. So here you see it with the porch removed. Christmas at the Orr home was a little bit different in 1997. Here you see Mike Potts placing the Christmas wreath on the home, maybe near where the front door was. Mike was the primary worker at the Orr home for the full period that it was being worked on and the adjacent museum. Recall our original project cost estimate of $76,000. When we put together the project to restore the home now, the cost estimate was $467,000. And also recall that we were having difficulty with the projected costs of the original project, so this presented a great challenge to us all. We did consider building a replica of the Orr home rather than restoring the old building, and that could probably have been done for half the cost of the restoration, but we didn't feel that that was consistent with the mission of the association. So what did we do with the near impossible challenge of raising $500,000 to restore the home? Well, we doubled it to $1 million and added building the new museum that had been talked about for many years by the Museum Association to the project. We redefined it as the Nathaniel Orr Pioneer Homesite Project and really emphasized the complete site. And this allowed us to expand the educational component of the project, which was key to the fundraising efforts. The first priority, of course, was the restoration of the home, and the first step in that process was to move the house off of its original site to an adjacent site, so that we would have full access to the basement area and a much easier method of constructing the new foundation and the new basement. Moving day was scheduled for December 28, 1997. We agreed that the only practical way to build a new foundation and to excavate the basement was by moving the house. This is in contrast to the original plan where we had planned to excavate in place, but at this point we knew that that really wasn't practical. In discussions with John Korsmo and a moving company, it was decided to move the house about 60 feet west. We were very concerned, we being John Korsmo and the Schma people, including myself, were very concerned that the house would collapse in the process, but we saw no other alternative. It was agreed that Steilacoom Historical Museum Association would assume all the risk for the move. We were on the hook for paying for the move, no matter whether it succeeded or failed. This is the back of the house just before we started the moving process. You can see the old aluminum support beams that were trapped underneath the house. And the way that the house was to be moved was to lift the house first, insert some new strong beams underneath the house, and then below the support beams insert some wheeled bogies that would allow the house to be pulled over towards what is now the museum and then was the old garage service station. In this picture, the house has been raised and the steel beams that run from front to back on the house have been inserted. These were done by the gentleman in the center you see crawling underneath the house as it rested on the ground and basically digging trenches from one end to the other and inserting those beams in there, raising it slightly, building a box structure to support that, and continuing the process till they had it at an elevation that they desired for the move. On the right side, you can see some rods sticking out and then across the back of the house. These are all threads, and all threads were placed at the first floor level and the second floor level, and they essentially run from one side of the house to the other side of the house and from front to back, and a plate is added and then bolts are added to the all thread, and they're adjusted to pull the house back to square by working with each one sequentially. It tied the house, gave it structural integrity, and also brought it back towards being square. The house is now up to approximately its original level, and you can see that it is kind of squared up. There's lots of temporary bracing in different locations, but it's basically ready for the wheeled bogies to be brought in so that the house can be moved. Blue tarps don't last very long in our climate. Recall that it was put in place in April 1997, and here we are in December 1997, and it's in pretty bad shape. The wheel bogies are in place, and the house is ready to move to the west, basically one full footprint of the house. The house is almost to its new location. It's moving toward where the museum is located right now. Watching the move is, from left to right, Gene Gerlich, the architect for the project, John Corsmo Jr., Joan Curtis, and John Corsmo Sr. At this point, I want to make clear that the Corsmos were not the contractor on the original work on the house. That contractor will go unnamed. It's better not to delve into that. John Corsmo Sr. is a longtime resident of Steilacoom, and I think he was instrumental in encouraging his son to take on this project. Here is the home in its new location. You can see that there's a better temporary roof that has now been added. Most of the great blue tarp is gone at this point. And you can see the bracing and the all-thread structure around the perimeter of the building. Our friend the Crow is up there. He was around continuously checking to make sure that things were done properly. So we have our Crow observer. The house itself was pushed up against the yew tree. The yew tree is still there. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that it's somewhat flattened on one side. And that was done. Some branches were removed, but also the house was kind of pushed against it in order to clear the original site for work to be done. The original home site is now clear, and we're ready for the foundation work. A temporary access road was constructed from Balch to the original Orr home site to provide access for the equipment that needed to get in for the foundation construction. Excavation for the basement is well underway. Can you imagine doing this by hand as was originally proposed? One of the alternate theories about why the house fell had been that there was a spring and a lot of water in this area near the front of the house, and that the support failed because it was basically on unstable wet ground. Well, when we did this excavation, there was absolutely no evidence of any water flow or any springs in this area. So I'm fairly certain that that was not a cause for the house falling. We're looking from the back to the front, and you can see the forms for the new foundation. And in the center are the special supports for the vertical posts that will be in the basement to provide primary structural support to the center of the house. The foundation and the side walls are complete at this point. You can see some stud walls towards the back of the basement. In order to move the house back onto the foundation, a temporary trestle, actually two temporary trestles, were built across the basement using the heavy beams that they originally used to raise the house. So they'll build the trestle, and now the wheel bogies will roll across the trestle to place the house back onto its original site. Once again, the house is raised a small amount to make room for the wheel bogies to come back in and move the house back to its original location. We are now a little bit short of 3 years from the date that the house fell, and we're ready to move it back onto its new foundation. The power for both moves of the home was provided by two large vehicles parked on one on Balch and the other on Main Street, and they had winches on them and connected to the bogies underneath the house via the cables. So the one on, in this case, the one on Balch is pulling the house towards the foundation as the bogies roll over those trestles, while the truck on Main Street is pulling back, or at least applying tension to make sure that the house doesn't get out of control and move too fast. And the foreman there is directing the move. You can see the cables and the workers guiding the bogies across the trestles. In the picture on the left, the house is almost back onto the foundation. Notice its position relative to the pear tree that saved the house when it fell. Success. The home is home. Looking a little bit worse for the wear, but we now are back to the point where we can actually start working on that home itself. Here's another view of the house back in its original location. Mike Potts is standing in front of the house there, but in front of Mike is a grapevine. And the house, when it was in its temporary location, sat on top of that grapevine. And apparently to no ill effects. You can go visit the grapevine today. Work continued to straighten and strengthen various parts of the building to bring the stairway back into alignment and to continue to square up the house. This is not a picture taken underneath the house before repairs were started. This is actually after the house is back on to its temporary foundation, but it looks a little bit like the haphazard work from before. What this is actually is the area below the kitchen floor where it had bulged up, and so there is some temporary bracing in here while we were trying to push that floor back down and get that particular part of the house aligned. This is all just temporary stuff. This is the after picture in that same area. You can see that the joists, some joists had to be replaced in this area, and others were strengthened by sistering another board next to them. And the beam through this area was also strengthened by adding another beam to it. So this essentially solved the problem in the kitchen area, and the floor was back to being level at this point. This is looking east in the large room at the back of the house that I call the family room. You can see some temporary structure that was added to the wall, mainly to provide additional support to the second floor, kind of a second ledger board up there. And then also the all threads running through the ceiling area holding the building together. The problem with the second floor was the way that it was attached to the remaining structure of the building. It was done by, first of all, mounting a ledger board to the wall itself and then putting a joist on top of the ledger board. However, the joist was notched to remove almost half of its structure, so the effective strength of the joist supporting the second floor was really only about half of the visible part of the joist. And so we expected that those had failed, and as you'll see in the next picture, that indeed is what happened. The addition of ceiling boards on the first floor and floorboards on the second floor, along with interior and exterior boards on the outside walls, provided some enhancement to the structure. The ceiling in the family room was removed to expose the joists for the second floor. And as you can see, exactly as had been postulated, each one of the joists split right along the dimension where it was notched to fit on the ledger board, the dark board, horizontal board on the wall. This is the after picture. The joists were repaired by jacking them back into place and then sistering some plywood strips onto each one of them. The notch was retained. That couldn't be replaced very easily, but the plywood structure adds many times the strength of the original joists. Three years after the fall of the home, and the new basement is in place. It has been enclosed on all four sides. This is the kitchen area where there was damage to the floor. The cast iron stove was removed when the furnishings were removed and taken for cleaning and repair. You can see here some of the temporary structure remains in place with the all threads and some beams to hold the structure in place. The stairway is not quite back in place, but it's getting close, and work to solve that problem was continuing. You can see the wallpaper has been stripped off in many areas. That's incomplete, but also there was a parallel effort to find the replacement wallpaper, replicating the original wallpaper in the house. In each of the rooms, 2 or 3 of the walls were covered with 1/4-inch plywood to provide additional shear strength. The interior walls consisted originally of vertical planks, and they were offset in each room so that you didn't have a crack that connecting the 2 rooms. But now we use the plywood to provide the additional strength, and on top of the plywood, a thin coat of plaster was applied so that it would appear as a smooth wall and not a plywood wall. This picture was taken in the part of the kitchen addition closest to the street, where there was a small workshop, probably Glenn's workshop in this area. Recall that this addition was added at a later date to the original structure of the home,
And so the wall that you're seeing here was originally an outside wall, and you can see the full dimension of each of those planks, very large rough cut wood. The structure of the workshop area was particularly poor, and in an area not shown as one of the corners that even lacked a corner post. So a corner post was added, and the plywood shear walls also. Here we see construction of the new porch. Remember that I said the porch had not been constructed in the manner of the original home, and showed evidence of fairly modern construction. I think it could have been done in the after 1900, 1920s even. It used modern 2x4s. All the dimensions of the lumber were the same as what we would purchase today. So the reconstruction did the same thing. This is consistent with historic preservation practice, where it would not have been authentic to make this look like it was part of the original home. Anyone looking at it would clearly know that it's an addition. So that's the structure you see going in here. We were aware of stories that Nathaniel's workshop originally included a Whim, a horse-drawn power source, in the backyard. This was used to power any of the tools that he had, perhaps a lathe or a saw or whatever, in his workshop. So we were on the lookout for anything that would provide evidence that the Whim actually existed. The way the Whim works is that the horse walks in a circle, rotating the vertical shaft, which is attached to some pulleys, and the pulleys connect to another shaft inside of the house or the workshop, from which other belts can be attached to drive power equipment. When we removed some of the siding at the rear of the house for the construction of the new porch, we found two circular cutouts through the original structure of the home in exactly the location that we expected for the Whim. So the existence of the Whim was confirmed. I found an illustration of how this system works at the Red Barn at the Boeing Company. You can see that the belts are attached to a rotating shaft in the ceiling, and these are attached to various tools. The next major part of the project was the repair of the roofs. Here you can see the roof over the shed after the shingles had been removed. In this construction, the cedar shingles are applied directly to the planks, and you can see the poor condition of the planks and the shingles. This was replaced with a modern roof structure, but cedar shingles were once again used as the finished surface. On the upper roof, most of the problems were confined to the place where the trusses met the joists, and so again, by sistering in new lumber, we could strengthen those junctions. But again, all of the old shingles, the cedar shingles, were removed, and a modern roof structure was built on top of the old planks, and cedar shingles were used as the final roofing. The new chimneys were not constructed of brick. These are faux chimneys at this point, with a wooden structure. Then thin brick laminate was applied on top of this to give the appearance of the original chimneys. This was done because concerns about the structure, the weight of solid brick chimneys would have been too much for the house structure in the long run. Here you see a finished faux chimney. The underlying structure of the new roof on both the addition, the kitchen addition, and the top roof are being applied at this point. You can see the 3 new chimneys. You may have noticed in an earlier picture that the siding had been removed in the upper floor, and that there was protective material being applied underneath, and then new siding was applied. And here the new siding has been installed, and this was specially milled to the original specifications of the siding on the house. When the siding was removed from the front of the house, it revealed the large workshop door that again we had theorized was present, and it is shown by the boards that are offset from the original vertical planks. A second door giving direct access to the kitchen add-on was found to the left. A second door to the kitchen add-on was found just around the corner. It doesn't make sense that both of these last 2 doors existed at the same time. They may have existed at different times for different purposes. Removing the siding on the front of the house also reveals some remarkable wood planks. These are the original rough cut planks that form the exterior of the home, of the workshop when it was first built. And you can see that this one is over 13¼ inches wide. The rear porch is ready for the windows to be installed, and our friend the pear tree is overseeing the whole project. Four and a half years from the time the house fell, the building is structurally complete and ready for interior restoration to begin. The work to restore the home structure and the exterior finishes was primarily done by professional contractors. In contrast, the interior restoration was done almost entirely by volunteers. This is what the interior looked like when the volunteers began their restoration effort. Even though there was much work to be done on the interior, it was very satisfying to see the exterior and that the home was once again looking perhaps better than it ever had. As part of the restoration work, one of the things that was done was to add a efficient heating system. And so in the basement, a full gas-driven heater was installed. We were able to provide for air circulation between the floors and hide some ducting in various parts of the house in order to provide good stable heating to the house year-round. Lou Parker was one of many who contributed to the interior restoration. When the house fell, we removed all of the architectural features from the house, and you saw that in the previous picture. It's pretty bare when it was turned back to the volunteers. But all the trim was removed, its position was recorded and stored. So one of the first efforts was to bring back all of the trim and reinstall it. and you see Lou here working on puttying some of the nail holes and things that were resulted from the reinstallation. Dennis Quackenbush was one of the primary workers on the restoration work. The work was performed on a scheduled basis. Every Thursday, a group of anywhere from a half dozen to a dozen people would meet and put in about 4 hours work. There were others that worked at other times, but the consistent work by the group on Thursday mornings accomplished quite a bit. This is the kitchen area coming back together. This is the upstairs bedroom at the rear of the house, and the painting and finishing work is complete in this area. The dining area looks almost as it did before the house fell. The cast iron wood stove has returned. Notice the way that it is attached to the chimney, as I described earlier. A pipe into the stack of bricks. Again, those are faux bricks at this point, but the heavy stack rested on a platform there. The floor has been repaired. You cannot see where the damage occurred. The floor has really bounced back. It was amazing in that we didn't really take extraordinary measures to protect them during the restoration, so they had a lot of heavy use, but they responded to the care and treatment of the volunteers who scrubbed them down and applied a new finish, and they look better than ever. The parlor with its new wallpaper and the restoration all around. The Museum Association had long expressed a desire to have a dedicated museum for its holdings. And as I noted previously, when we expanded the project to be the Nathaniel Orr Pioneer Home Site, we included the museum in that plan. Now, on the corner was located the old shed, and this was perhaps used for a variety of purposes, but one of the uses had been as a service station and car repair. And it was a relatively poor construction, was probably, again, built in the early 1920s or 30s. And it was basically could not be salvaged. It was poor construction, but also there was a lot of contamination. Some asbestos was detected. And also, as during its use as a service station, it appears that oil had just been dumped on the ground, which I guess was a fairly common practice. So we basically had to clean up that site first. So we decided not to use the shed. It was demolished, and a new building was built. And on the next slide, you'll see a little compressed video of the destruction of the old shed and the construction of the new museum. I mentioned that we had expanded the project from about a $500,000 restoration of the Orr home to include the museum, and that along with site improvements to bring it up to ADA standards brought it up to $1 million project. Well, the process of raising that money is another subject altogether. But briefly, it was accomplished with great assistance from Congressman Norm Dix, who early on assisted in providing $250,000 from the Save America's Treasures program that was underway at that time. The $250,000 from the federal government, actually through the National Park Service, permitted us to match funds from the Washington State Historical Society's Heritage Resource Center. We received over $300,000 from them. We received numerous grants from community foundations and charities. We also had the contribution of our own membership and the in-kind labor. And it all came together so that when we completed the project, we had raised the $1 million. It was done with no debt whatsoever. This picture shows Congressman Dix visiting the site when it was complete with then President Shelley Schallenberger and curator Joan Curtis. We can't overstate the importance of the funding that was provided with Congressman Dix's assistance. All through the project, we had the support of an engaged board. They participated in the process on a monthly basis through the board meetings and assisted with all phases of the project. These are pictures of a few of the members, but over the 6-year period of the project, there were many others involved through the board. The rededication of the home was held on May 4th, 2002, 6 years after the home fell. When we started, we said this may take 10 years, so we actually beat our schedule in completing it in 6. The contributors were listed in the program for that day's event. Fundraising for this project was essentially accomplished by 3 people: Mary Ann Bohl, Joan Curtis, and myself. And we worked for the entire period of the project to raise funds to meet the bills as they came in. Christmas at the Orr home returned in November 2002. The lead contractor after the fall of the home, as I noted before, was John Korsmo Construction, and they contributed in many ways, but one of the most important was in the flexibility on billing and payments. They carried us many times while construction continued and we were behind on payments and until we could catch up. John worked with Gray Lumber, who also made many contributions in terms of materials to the project, and John accessed many subcontractors who also assisted with the project. The architect for the project is Gene Gerlich, a noted historic preservation architect in the Puget Sound area. Our thanks to all of them. I mentioned Mike Potts before, but I want to mention him again. He was almost there continuously for the period that the home was being rebuilt and handled a great deal of the work on his own. He was assisted by members in some of the larger parts of the project, but Mike was a key contributor to the restoration of the Orr home. I want to conclude with a list of the volunteers. I'm sure I missed someone. It's almost impossible not to. We had a lot of volunteers. These are the ones that I did have some documentation on, and we want to extend once again our thanks to all of them for the work that they contributed.